The wind howled through the ancient trees, their gnarled branches clawing at the darkening sky as the last rays of sunlight vanished behind the mountains. The village of Corveth lay nestled in the valley below, shrouded in twilight, a place forgotten by time and men. It wasn't the kind of place people visited or even spoke of. Corveth was a shadowed name whispered in taverns only by those who dared to remember the curse. Elara stood at the edge of the forest, her fingers tightly clutching the strap of her leather bag. The letter, crumpled and worn from being read 100 times, rested in her pocket. Her brother's last words, "Find me at the heart of Corveth. All will be revealed." He had vanished 3 years ago, no trace left behind except for this one message, mysteriously delivered to her doorstep just days ago. No one else had dared venture near Corveth since the old stories began to spread. The stories of things lurking in the dark, of villagers who had vanished in the night. She glanced back at the narrow path she had taken through the forest, now swallowed by the encroaching fog, before turning her gaze forward. Corveth was right ahead, barely visible through the mist, the faint glimmer of its ancient streets like a distant memory. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was no turning back now. Elara descended into the valley, the air growing colder with every step. The village seemed empty at first glance, but she felt eyes on her, watching from the shadows of crooked houses, from windows that seemed sealed shut. A heavy silence lay over the place, broken only by the creak of a sign swinging in the wind, the rusted letters spelling Corveth in. She hesitated before entering, the door creaking open to reveal a dimly lit interior. The innkeeper, a haggard man with deep-set eyes, looked up from the counter as she approached. His gaze lingered on her longer than she liked, but he said nothing until she reached him. "You're not from here," he said, his voice raspy, as if he hadn't spoken in years. "I'm looking for someone," she replied, her voice steady despite the weight of the place pressing down on her. "My brother. He sent me a letter from here." The innkeeper's face darkened. "People come to Corveth, but they don't leave. You'd best forget whatever brought you here, girl, and turn back now, before it's too late." "I'm not leaving without him," Elara said firmly, refusing to back down. The innkeeper watched her in silence for a moment before sighing deeply, as if her fate had already been sealed. "You'll find nothing but sorrow here. But if you're set on finding him, try the chapel. It's at the village center. They say it's where the darkness gathers." Elara nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a shroud, but she had no choice. She left the inn and headed toward the chapel, her every step echoing in the empty streets. The village felt alive, as if the very stones of the road beneath her feet were watching, waiting for something. The fog thickened as she approached the chapel, an old, crumbling structure that seemed out of place even in Corveth. Its tall spire jutted into the sky like a dagger, piercing the veil of clouds that had begun to gather overhead. The doors groaned as she pushed them open, the smell of damp and decay filling her senses. Inside, the chapel was eerily quiet, rows of broken pews covered in dust. At the far end stood an altar, but it wasn't the altar that caught her eye. It was the figure kneeling before it, shrouded in black, motionless. "Brother?" Elara whispered, her voice barely audible in the heavy silence. The figure didn't move. She took a cautious step forward, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound of her boots on the stone floor echoed unnaturally in the hollow space. She reached for the figure's shoulder, but just before her hand made contact, the figure stood, turning slowly to face her. It wasn't her brother. A pair of hollow, glowing eyes stared back at her from beneath the hood. The creature's skin was pale, almost translucent, and it smiled, a sharp, twisted grin that sent a chill down her spine. "You are too late," it hissed, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "He belongs to the darkness now." Before Elara could react, the creature lunged at her, faster than she could have imagined. She threw herself backward, barely avoiding its grasp. The creature laughed, a terrible, grating sound, as it dissolved into the shadows of the chapel. Elara's breath came in ragged gasps as she scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She had expected danger, but this was something else entirely. Suddenly, the chapel door slammed shut with a thunderous bang, plunging the room into near-total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the altar, which now seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural energy. Elara's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet were frozen in place as she realized something terrible. This was just the beginning. From the shadows, more figures began to emerge, their hollow eyes glowing with the same eerie light. They whispered her brother's name in unison, their voices melding into one, a chilling chorus that filled the chapel. Elara's mind spun with panic, but she knew she had to keep moving. She turned toward the back of the chapel, where a narrow staircase descended into the crypts below. Without thinking, she ran toward it, the creatures closing in behind her. She could hear their claws scraping against the stone, their whispers growing louder with each step she took. As she reached the staircase, she glanced back once, just in time to see the creatures disappear, swallowed by the shadows once more. But the darkness itself seemed alive now, crawling toward her like a living thing. She descended into the crypts, the air growing colder and more oppressive the deeper she went. The faint light from her lantern flickered, casting long shadows on the damp stone walls. She could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance, but it was the silence between the drops that unnerved her, the waiting silence, as if something ancient and terrible was listening to her every move. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a vast underground chamber. Rows of sarcophagi lined the walls, each one carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift in the dim light. At the far end of the chamber stood a large stone door, unlike anything Elara had ever seen. The symbols on it pulsed faintly, as though alive. And there, lying before the door, was her brother. She ran to him, her heart pounding in her chest, but as she reached him, she realized something was terribly wrong. His skin was pale, his eyes closed, and he didn't move when she called his name. Kneeling beside him, she felt for a pulse. He was alive, but barely. Before she could react, the door behind him began to shift. It groaned as if something immense and powerful was stirring on the other side. The symbols on the stone glowed brighter, and from the cracks in the door, tendrils of shadow began to seep out, snaking toward her and her brother. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and Elara knew she had only moments before whatever was behind that door broke free. But just as she prepared to move, a voice echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have come to unlock the chronicle, and now the craft begins." The voice reverberated through the crypt like a thunderclap, shaking the stone walls. Elara froze, her breath catching in her throat as the chamber seemed to pulse with some unseen power. Her eyes darted to her brother's pale form, and then to the stone door, which was now groaning as the tendrils of shadow continued to snake through its cracks. The symbols carved into the door pulsated brighter, almost rhythmically, like the heartbeat of some ancient beast. She could feel the presence beyond the door, something vast and unknowable, and it terrified her to the core. But more than that, the voice's words lingered in her mind. "You have come to unlock the chronicle, and now the craft begins." What did it mean? What was the chronicle? And what kind of craft had she unwittingly set in motion? Her hands trembled as she shook her brother again, trying to rouse him. "Aren," she whispered desperately, "please, wake up. I need you." But he remained motionless, his chest rising and falling slowly, as if caught in a deep, unnatural sleep. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the stone door, as if whatever lay behind it had sensed her desperation. The air grew heavier, thick with a strange, oppressive force. Elara realized that whatever power was in this place was beginning to awaken, and it was hungry. With a deep breath, she stood, her eyes darting around the chamber, searching for anything that might help her. The sarcophagi along the walls were ancient, their surfaces etched with the same strange symbols as the door. Each one seemed to pulse with that same dim, rhythmic light. And then she noticed something. One of the sarcophagi near the far wall was different. It had a single large symbol etched into it, much larger and more elaborate than the others. It glowed brighter, too, almost as if it was calling to her. Instinct pushed her toward it. She ran her fingers over the cool stone, tracing the lines of the symbol. As soon as she touched it, the symbol flared brightly, and a deep click echoed through the chamber. The door at the far end of the room groaned even louder now, as if whatever was behind it was pressing harder, pushing against its prison. But it wasn't just the door that reacted. The sarcophagi lining the walls began to shift, the lids sliding open with a scraping sound that sent shivers down her spine. The ground trembled again as dark shapes began to rise from the stone tombs, their forms twisted and shadowy, like the creatures from the chapel, but somehow more solid, more real. Elara's heart pounded as she backed away, her mind racing. There had to be a way out, some way to stop this, or at least delay it. She glanced down at her brother, still lying helpless near the door, and the growing darkness creeping toward him. Suddenly, the symbol on the sarcophagus she had touched flared once more, and the stone lid slid open completely. Inside, there was no body, only a scroll, old and worn, resting atop a slab of polished stone. It glowed faintly, just like the symbols, and as Elara hesitated, something deep inside her told her this was what she had been searching for. She reached out and grasped the scroll. The moment her fingers closed around it, the shadowy creatures that had risen from the other sarcophagi stopped in their tracks. Their hollow eyes turned toward her, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of their gazes, hungry, ancient, waiting. Then, without warning, the scroll unraveled in her hand, the parchment floating above her, suspended in the air by some unseen force. Strange symbols, similar to those on the walls, began to appear on the parchment, glowing with an ethereal light. Elara stared, entranced, as the symbols rearranged themselves, forming a pattern, and then the voice returned, deeper now, more insistent. The chronicle has been opened. The craft is yours to command. Elara blinked, her mind reeling. What craft? What was happening? Before she could ask, the symbols on the scroll shifted again, this time forming a single word she could understand: bind. Without thinking, she spoke the word aloud. Bind. The moment the word left her lips, the creatures that had been advancing toward her brother froze. Their forms began to waver, their shadowy edges flickering like candle flames in the wind. And then, slowly, they began to dissolve, their twisted shapes unraveling like smoke, until they were nothing but faint whispers in the air. Elara stood in stunned silence, staring at where the creatures had been. The scroll floated back down into her hands, and as she gripped it, the symbols on the stone door dimmed, the tendrils of shadow retreating back into the cracks. The silence that followed was deafening. She knelt beside her brother again, her hands shaking as she touched his shoulder. "Aren," she whispered, but he still didn't stir. Whatever had a hold on him wasn't letting go easily. Suddenly, a low chuckle echoed from the shadows of the crypt, a sound so cold and malevolent that it sent a shiver down Elara's spine. She stood quickly, turning toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. "You've barely scratched the surface," the voice said, its tone mocking. "You think you can control the chronicle, but you are merely a pawn in a game far older than you can imagine." Elara's grip tightened on the scroll, her heart racing. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, there was a pause, as if whoever, or whatever it was considering its response. "I am the keeper of the craft," it finally said, its voice dripping with dark amusement. "And now, you are bound to it. The chronicle has chosen you, and there is no escape." Elara swallowed hard, the weight of the words settling over her like a heavy cloak. She had come to Corveth to find her brother, but now it seemed she had stumbled into something far greater, something ancient and dangerous. The voice faded, leaving only silence in its wake. Elara stood there, staring at the scroll in her hands, her mind spinning with questions. What had she unleashed? What did the chronicle want from her? And more importantly, how could she save her brother from whatever darkness had claimed him? But as she stared at the glowing symbols on the scroll, one thing was certain. This was far from over. And the real nightmare was only just beginning. The silence of the crypt was suffocating, pressing down on Elara as she clutched the ancient scroll. The faint glow of the symbols pulsed softly, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls around her. She could still feel the lingering presence of the voice, as if it were watching her, waiting for her next move. Her eyes flicked back to her brother, Aren, lying motionless at the base of the great stone door. His breathing was shallow, his skin cold to the touch, but he was alive, at least for now. Elara couldn't shake the sensation that time was running out. The scroll in her hands felt unnervingly warm, as though it were alive. She could still see the word bind glowing faintly at the top, but below it, the symbols began to shift once more, rearranging themselves into a new pattern. As she watched, another word emerged from the swirling characters, unlock. Her heart skipped a beat. The meaning was clear. Whatever lay behind that stone door, she had the power to open it now. But the memory of the shadowy tendrils creeping through the cracks and the voices' dark, mocking laughter haunted her. What was sealed behind that door? And more importantly, was she really ready to face it? The decision weighed heavily on her, but the more she hesitated, the more urgent the situation felt. Every second spent here could be the difference between saving her brother or losing him forever to whatever dark force had claimed him. The word on the scroll shimmered brighter, as if the chronicle itself was urging her onward. But then, from the far end of the crypt, there came a faint sound, a whisper, almost too soft to hear. Elara's head snapped in that direction, her breath catching in her throat. The crypt, already cold, seemed to drop several degrees. She wasn't alone down here. For a moment, there was only silence, and then the whisper came again, faint but distinct, echoing through the stone chamber. It was a voice, different from the deep, menacing one she had heard before. This voice was softer, more familiar. Elara. She froze. Her name, spoken in that low whisper. It was Aren's voice. Her heart pounded, and she turned back to where her brother lay. But he hadn't moved, still unconscious, still trapped in whatever dark sleep held him. And yet the whisper had come from elsewhere, somewhere deep within the crypt. Elara, please. It was him. She knew it. Gathering her courage, Elara stood and stepped toward the shadows at the edge of the crypt. The air seemed thicker here, colder, and she could feel the oppressive weight of something ancient pressing down on her. Her lantern's light flickered, struggling against the darkness, and the whispers grew louder, pulling her deeper into the gloom. The passage beyond the chamber was narrow and winding, the walls close enough to scrape her arms as she walked. She could hear the distant drip of water, the echo of her own footsteps, and always the faint sound of Aren's voice calling to her, urging her forward. The corridor led to a smaller, hidden chamber, its entrance almost completely obscured by thick, twisted roots that had broken through the stone over the centuries. She pushed through them, her breath shallow, and stepped inside. The room was small, lit only by a single, weak flame that flickered at the far end. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was Aren. Her breath caught in her throat. He was standing, his back to her, dressed in the same clothes he had worn the day he disappeared, his dark hair hanging over his face. But something was wrong. His stance was too still, too rigid, and when she called out to him, "Aren," he didn't respond. He didn't even move. The air in the chamber felt wrong, thick with an unnatural stillness. Elara's pulse quickened, every instinct screaming at her that something wasn't right. She took a tentative step closer, her eyes fixed on her brother. And then he turned. Elara gasped, stumbling backward. His face. It wasn't Aren's face at all. His features were twisted, contorted, as though something had hollowed him out and worn his skin like a mask. His eyes, once warm and full of life, were now black voids, empty and soulless. A chilling smile spread across his face, wide and unnatural. "You came for me," the creature said, its voice a mockery of Aren's. How sweet. Elara's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. This thing, it wasn't Aren. It was something else, something that had taken his form. She stepped back, her hands trembling, but the creature's grin only widened. "Did you think you could save him?" it asked, its voice dripping with malice. "He belongs to us now." Without warning, The creature lunged at her, faster than she could react. Elara barely had time to raise her hands before the thing was on her, its cold, twisted fingers wrapping around her throat. She gasped, struggling to breathe as its grip tightened. Its face inches from hers, the stench of decay overwhelming her senses. Her vision blurred, the edges of her world darkening, but as the creature's grip tightened, something inside her stirred. An instinct, a flicker of power from the chronicle that she had unlocked. Her fingers still clutched the scroll, and as she struggled to free herself, she focused on the symbols glowing on the parchment. Unlock. With the last of her strength, she whispered the word, her voice barely audible. The scroll flared brightly, blinding her for a moment, and the creature recoiled, hissing in pain as light erupted from the scroll and engulfed them both. Elara collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as the creature writhed in agony, its form distorting and shifting in the light. It screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound, before dissolving into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but a faint, oily residue on the stone floor. Panting, Elara slowly pushed herself to her feet. Her whole body trembled, but she couldn't stop now. Whatever that thing had been, it was only a piece of the larger darkness that had taken Aren. She could feel it, lurking in the crypts, watching her every move. She turned back toward the main chamber, the scroll still glowing faintly in her hands. She didn't know what awaited her behind the stone door, but the chronicle had given her some control, some power over the dark forces in this place. And now, with Aren's life hanging in the balance, she had no choice but to use it. Taking a deep breath, Elara walked back into the chamber where her brother lay. The stone door loomed before her, its symbols dim but pulsing, as though waiting for her command. Her fingers tightened around the scroll as she approached the door. The word unlock shimmered brightly once more, and she knew what she had to do. But as she raised the scroll and prepared to speak the word again, the deep, malevolent voice returned, colder and darker than before. "You've made your choice," it hissed, the very air around her trembling with its power. "Now, face what lies within." Elara hesitated, her pulse quickening as the door began to groan, the cracks widening. And then, with a deafening rumble, the door slowly began to open. She stared into the abyss beyond, where nothing but darkness awaited. And then the darkness began to move. The darkness beyond the door seemed alive, a thick, roiling mass that shifted and churned like a living thing. Elara stood frozen at the threshold, her heart pounding in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The heavy stone door had opened, and whatever lay beyond was waiting for her. She took a step forward, feeling the cold air from the darkness brush against her skin. It was unnaturally cold, as though the void itself was reaching out to consume her. The scroll in her hand pulsed again, the word unlock now fading and replaced by a new symbol, a symbol she didn't recognize, but one that seemed to hum with a dangerous, unstable energy. The voice returned, slithering through the air like a serpent. "You sought to unravel the chronicle," it whispered, cold and mocking. "Now the craft is yours, and the darkness will test your will." Elara's grip tightened on the scroll, her fingers trembling as she took another cautious step into the darkness. The chamber beyond the door was vast, far larger than it had any right to be, as though the space itself had warped into something unnatural. Tendrils of shadow curled along the floor, reaching up the walls like twisted veins, pulsing with faint, ghostly light. And in the center of it all, suspended in midair, was Aren. Her brother floated just above the ground, his body limp, surrounded by a cocoon of shadow that seemed to pulse and throb with life. His eyes were closed, and his skin had taken on an even more deathly pallor, as if the very life was being drained from him. The tendrils of darkness were wrapped around his limbs, tethering him to the abyss, feeding on him. Elara's breath caught in her throat as she rushed forward, but the moment she tried to reach him, the shadows lashed out, slamming into her with a force that sent her sprawling back against the stone floor. Pain shot through her body, but she scrambled to her feet, desperate to free her brother. "You cannot touch him," the voice hissed, now louder, more present. He is part of the craft now, bound to it as you are. Elara's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, what she was hearing. Bound? Part of the craft? What did it all mean? Her brother wasn't just trapped. He was being consumed by whatever force had taken hold of Corveth. And if she didn't act soon, he would be lost forever. The scroll flared in her hand again, the symbols shifting once more, this time revealing something new. An intricate pattern, spiraling across the parchment like a map of some twisted logic she couldn't fully comprehend. But one word stood out to her, clear and bold in the center of the pattern. Sever. She stared at the word, feeling its weight in her mind. Could it break the connection between Aren and the darkness? Could it sever the bond that tied him to whatever dark force had claimed him? Without hesitation, she whispered the word aloud. Sever. The effect was immediate. The chamber trembled, and the tendrils of shadow surrounding Aren recoiled, writhing as though they had been burned. The cocoon of darkness around him began to unravel, the shadowy threads pulling away from his body. For a brief, flickering moment, Elara felt hope surge in her chest. But then the voice came again, furious and filled with malice. You cannot break what has already been woven, it roared, the ground beneath her feet shaking with the force of its anger. Suddenly, the tendrils of shadow shot toward her, faster than she could react. They wrapped around her wrists and ankles, yanking her forward, dragging her toward the heart of the abyss. Elara struggled, pulling against the dark bindings, but they tightened, cold and unyielding, as they dragged her closer to the swirling mass of shadows. The scroll in her hand flickered, its glow dimming as the darkness closed in around her. She could feel the cold seep into her bones, sapping her strength, and her vision began to blur. But she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when Aren was so close. Her mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could help her. The scroll was still warm in her hand, the symbols shifting, but they moved too quickly for her to understand. She needed to focus, to find the right word, the right command. But the shadows pressed in on her, whispering in her ear, filling her thoughts with doubt and fear. You are nothing, the voice taunted. A mere pawn in a game you cannot hope to win. Surrender, and your suffering will end. Elara gritted her teeth, her vision swimming as the tendrils pulled her closer to the heart of the abyss. The cold was overwhelming now, numbing her limbs, her mind, but she clung to the scroll like a lifeline. And then, just as the darkness threatened to swallow her whole, she saw it. One last word, faint but unmistakable, glowing at the edge of the parchment. Wield. Without thinking, she shouted the word. Wield. A shockwave of energy exploded from the scroll, radiating outward in a blinding flash of light. The tendrils of shadow recoiled violently, shrieking as they were ripped away from her, and for a moment, the entire chamber was filled with a blinding, searing light. Elara collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, as the tendrils released their grip. When she looked up, she saw the shadows recoiling, writhing as if in pain. The scroll in her hand burned with an intense light, the symbols no longer shifting but holding steady, glowing with a power that felt ancient, immense. The chronicle, the craft, was no longer a passive force. She could feel it now, surging through her veins, the knowledge of countless ages at her fingertips. But the darkness wasn't done with her yet. The voice, now full of rage and desperation, thundered through the chamber. You dare to wield the craft against me? You are but a child playing with forces you cannot comprehend. The shadows surged forward again, this time more violently, more desperate, but Elara was ready. She stood, the scroll glowing brighter, her hands steady now as the chronicle's power flowed through her. The symbols on the parchment danced before her eyes, showing her the way, guiding her hand. With a single motion, she raised the scroll, and the shadows stopped, as if held in place by an unseen force. The tendrils writhed, struggling against the invisible barrier, but they could not move. Elara took a step forward, her voice steady as she spoke, the words no longer foreign to her but natural, as though they had been etched into her very soul. Release him, she commanded, her voice ringing with authority, or be destroyed. The shadows shuddered, the entire chamber trembling as the voice let out a howl of fury. But even as the darkness thrashed against the light of the chronicle, Elara knew the tide had turned. She could feel the power coursing through her, binding her to the craft, and with it, the authority to command the darkness. But the abyss still loomed, its heart vast and unknowable, and deep within it, something ancient stirred. Something far older and more dangerous than the shadows themselves. And as Elara prepared to take her final step toward freeing her brother, she realized this was only the beginning. Elara stood on the edge of the abyss, her breath shallow and her heart racing. The scroll in her hands pulsed with power, but the energy within it was wild, volatile. The tendrils of shadow, though momentarily subdued, quivered at the edges of the chamber, waiting for a moment of weakness. She could feel the immense, ancient force that had been awakened beyond the door, something far more dangerous than the dark whispers and shadows that had tried to consume her. She took a step toward her brother, her eyes locked on his still, floating form. Aren hung suspended in the air, the last remnants of the shadowy cocoon still clinging to him like black threads. His face was pale, his eyes closed, and though the darkness had momentarily retreated, she could see it lurking just beneath the surface of his skin, like something alive, feeding off him. "Stay with me, Aren," she whispered, the words more for herself than for him. She didn't know if he could hear her, or if he was even still the same person inside. But she had come too far to turn back now. The voice, the keeper of this place, was silent for the moment, but Elara knew it was watching, waiting. She could feel its malevolent presence in the air, seething with anger, but it had retreated to the depths of the abyss, no doubt gathering its strength for another strike. The scroll in her hands hummed again, the symbols shifting, rearranging themselves into a new configuration. Elara's eyes narrowed as she focused on them, trying to decipher their meaning. It felt like a puzzle, a language of power she was only beginning to understand. One word stood out to her, glowing faintly in the center of the scroll: bridge. A bridge? Her mind raced. Was it suggesting she form a connection between herself and Aren? Or was it something deeper, something to link the Chronicle's power with the force that held him captive? The risk was great, but Elara had no choice. Whatever the abyss was, it had Aren in its grip, and only the Chronicle's strange power seemed capable of facing it. Taking a deep breath, she focused on the word and spoke it aloud. Bridge. The moment the word left her lips, the chamber around her trembled. A low, resonant hum filled the air, and the shadows in the room seemed to ripple in response. From the scroll, a bright, ethereal thread of light extended outward, shimmering like a living thing. It reached toward Aren, the light winding through the air like a silver strand, thin but strong. Elara watched as the thread connected with Aren's chest, and the moment it did, she felt a jolt. An electric shock that ran through her body, as though the Chronicle had just tied her to him. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. She could feel Aren's presence now, faint but there, deep within the abyss where the darkness had dragged him. And with it, she felt something else, something ancient, watching her from the depths. Elara gripped the scroll tightly, trying to focus, trying to steady herself against the sudden wave of energy that coursed through the bridge. She could feel Aren's heartbeat, faint but persistent, his mind flickering somewhere in the void. But alongside it was the cold, dark presence that had ensnared him, vast and unknowable, like a predator lurking just beyond her reach. Aren, she called again, her voice trembling. I'm here. I'm going to get you out. But as soon as she spoke, the presence in the abyss stirred. The shadows in the chamber surged toward her, the tendrils lashing out with renewed fury. The bridge of light trembled under the assault, flickering as the shadows tried to tear it apart. The air thickened, heavy with the oppressive force of the ancient entity that dwelled in the darkness. You are too late. The voice returned, darker, angrier. He belongs to us. And so will you. Elara's grip on the scroll tightened, her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness was closing in on her, pressing against the fragile bridge of light that connected her to Aren. She could feel the power of the Chronicle pushing back, but it was weakening. The shadows were relentless, and the entity in the abyss was far stronger than anything she had ever faced. But she wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not after coming this far. She focused all her energy on the scroll, on the bridge that connected her to her brother. The Chronicle had given her power, but it was still a mystery, its full potential untapped. She needed more strength, more understanding, more control. As if in response to her thoughts, the symbols on the scroll shifted again, faster this time, rearranging into a new pattern. One word emerged, bold and clear in the center of the swirling characters: bind. It was the same word she had used to subdue the shadowy creatures before. But this time, it felt different, stronger, more final. It wasn't just a command to hold back the darkness. It was a command to bind herself to the Chronicle, to wield its power fully and without reservation. Elara hesitated for only a moment before she spoke the word aloud. Bind. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The scroll flared with an intense, blinding light, and Elara felt the power of the Chronicle surge through her like wildfire. The bridge between her and Aren solidified, the tendrils of light growing thicker, stronger, and the shadows that had been clawing at them recoiled, hissing as the light burned them away. The entire chamber shuddered, and for the first time, Elara felt the presence in the abyss falter. The voice, once so confident and mocking, was now filled with rage and fear. No! It roared, the sound shaking the very walls. You cannot control it. You are nothing. Nothing but a speck in the endless dark. But Elara no longer listened. The Chronicle's power flowed through her, and with it came the knowledge she had been missing, the understanding of what the craft truly was. It wasn't just a source of power. It was a key, a means to control the ancient forces that had been locked away for millennia. And now it was hers. The bridge of light between her and Aren pulsed, the connection deepening as Elara focused all her energy on freeing him. The shadows that had held him in place began to unravel, the dark tendrils shrinking and retreating as the Chronicle's power consumed them. And then, slowly, Aren's eyes flickered open. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, his gaze unfocused. But then his eyes found Elara, and recognition sparked in them. Elara? His voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it was him. Truly him. Tears of relief welled in her eyes as she reached out toward him, the bridge of light pulling them closer. I'm here, Aren. I've got you. But before she could close the distance, the shadows surged again, a final, desperate attack from the abyss. The air crackled with dark energy as the entity unleashed its full power, trying to sever the connection between them. You think you've won? The voice snarled, furious and venomous. You are a fool. The Chronicle's craft is beyond your control. It will consume you as it has consumed all before you. Elara braced herself, the scroll in her hands glowing with the full force of the Chronicle's power. She could feel the darkness pressing against her, but she didn't falter. She had already made her choice. And as the shadows closed in around her, she raised the scroll one final time, her voice steady and filled with resolve. No, she said, her eyes burning with determination. I control it now. With a final surge of power, she unleashed the full might of the Chronicle. The abyss roared in fury as the shadows were torn apart, consumed by the blinding light. The presence in the abyss screamed, a sound of pure rage and despair, before it was silenced, swallowed by the power of the craft. And then, for the first time since entering the crypt, there was silence. Elara collapsed to her knees, exhausted but victorious. The scroll in her hands dimmed, the symbols fading as the power of the Chronicle settled. Aren lay beside her, weak but alive, the dark tendrils that had bound him gone. But the shadows still lingered at the edges of the chamber, watching, waiting. Elara knelt there for a moment, her breath shallow, heart pounding in her chest. The silence in the chamber was eerie, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The Chronicle's power had receded, but its presence still pulsed faintly within her, like an ember waiting to ignite again. She looked over at Aren, still lying on the cold stone floor, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He was alive, but something was wrong. She could feel it. The chamber was darker now, the shadows at the edges seeming to thicken, swirling ominously. Though she had defeated the immediate threat, she could sense that the entity in the abyss was not gone. Not fully. It was merely retreating, regathering its strength. And even more unsettling, Elara realized that the Chronicle had not shown her everything yet. A low hum began to echo through the chamber, a vibration that Elara could feel in her bones. The ground trembled, just slightly, but enough to make her uneasy. Something deeper was stirring, and whatever it was, it had been awakened by her actions. With a groan, Aren stirred beside her, his eyes flickering open. His hand twitched, and for a moment, his gaze found hers. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Elara, what happened?" She squeezed his hand, forcing a smile. "I got you out. You're safe now. The darkness. It tried to take you, but I stopped it." Aren tried to sit up but winced, his body too weak to support his weight. I remember the shadows. But there was something else. Something deeper. I couldn't fight it." Elara glanced toward the swirling darkness that still hovered at the edges of the chamber. She hadn't fought it off completely. "It's still here. We need to leave. Now." But as she tried to help Aren to his feet, the scroll in her hand pulsed again, the light flaring briefly. Elara looked down at it, her stomach tightening. The symbols had rearranged themselves once more, but this time the word that stood out chilled her to the bone. "Return. Return," she muttered under her breath. What did it mean? Before she could contemplate further, a familiar, mocking voice echoed in the chamber, dripping with malice. "You thought you could sever the ties so easily?" The voice wasn't just in her head this time. It was everywhere, wrapping around her like a cold, invisible fog. "You do not understand the depths of the Chronicle's craft. What you have unleashed is beyond your control." Elara's skin prickled, her breath catching in her throat. She looked around, her eyes searching the darkness, but there was no form, no figure. Only the voice, omnipresent, seeping into the air like poison. "Your brother is bound," it continued, the tone filled with cruel delight. "As are you, child. You've only just scratched the surface. There is no escape from this place. Not for him and not for you." Elara's hands trembled, her grip tightening around the scroll. She had felt the bond when she used the Chronicle to save Aren, felt the power linking them together. But now, she realized, the connection wasn't just between them. The abyss had latched onto them both, entwining its dark tendrils in ways she hadn't yet grasped. Aren, still weak, groaned in pain. "Elara, something's wrong? I can feel it. The darkness, it's still inside me." Her heart clenched as she looked at him. His skin was pallid, almost translucent, and there was a faint shimmer of shadow beneath it, like ink spreading through water. Whatever had taken him wasn't gone. It had left a piece of itself inside him, festering. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't let it take you again." But even as she said the words, the Chronicle shifted in her hand, the symbols swirling in a frantic dance. The word return burned brighter, as though the scroll was urging her towards something inevitable. The room darkened further, the shadows closing in, and the faint hum grew louder, more insistent. The voice spoke again, softer this time, almost coaxing. "You know what you must do, Elara. You cannot save him with strength alone. The craft, the Chronicle, it demands sacrifice. You wield it, yes, but its true power lies in understanding the cost. To sever one bond, you must strengthen another." A cold realization swept over her. The word return. It wasn't just a command. It was a choice. The Chronicle was offering her a way to save Aren, but there would be a price. What that price was, she couldn't yet comprehend, but she could feel it looming, like a great, terrible weight pressing down on her. Aren, his voice weak and barely audible, spoke again. "Elara, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come here. I thought I could find the answers, but it's too late for me." "No," she said sharply, her voice echoing in the chamber. "It's not too late. I'm not losing you." The shadows around them shifted, almost as if they were listening, waiting for her decision. The Chronicle symbols continued to dance across the scroll, the power inside it growing more intense by the second. The choice was before her now: return, to sever one bond. She whispered, the weight of the words sinking in. The entity lurking in the abyss stirred again, its presence pressing against her mind, cold and ancient. It wasn't going to let them leave, not without extracting something in return. The Chronicle's craft had awakened forces older and darker than she could have imagined. And now, she was standing at the edge of an impossible choice. I can feel it inside me, Aren murmured, his hand gripping hers weakly. It's not letting go. Elara, please. Don't let it take you too. Tears welled in her eyes. She was losing him. The darkness was still inside him, and it was growing. The Chronicle had the power to save him, but it was asking for something she wasn't sure she could give. The chamber trembled again, the abyss calling, the voice whispering in her ear. You are bound, Elara. There is no escape from the craft, only submission. Return, and you may yet save him. Elara's hand hovered over the scroll, her mind racing. Could she do it? Could she wield the full power of the Chronicle, even if it meant binding herself to something darker? She had fought so hard to save Aren, but now it seemed like the very thing that had given her power was demanding a price she hadn't been prepared to pay. The shadows crept closer, swirling around her feet, coiling like serpents. The choice loomed before her, vast and inescapable. With trembling hands, she whispered, return. The moment the word left her lips, the entire chamber shifted, the air growing thick and heavy. The scroll in her hand flared with blinding light, and for a split second, everything went still. Time itself seemed to pause, as if the world was holding its breath. Then, with a deafening roar, the abyss opened wide. Aren screamed, the darkness inside him flaring to life, and Elara felt the Chronicle's power surge through her, wild and uncontrollable. The shadows surged toward her, and for a moment, she felt as though she was falling, tumbling into the endless void. But just as quickly, the light from the scroll exploded outward, a force so powerful it shook the very foundation of the crypt. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as they were torn apart by the light, and the voice from the abyss screamed in fury. The connection between her and Aren snapped, and Elara was thrown backward, her body slamming into the stone floor. Pain shot through her, but she barely felt it as she struggled to stand, the light from the scroll flickering wildly. When she looked up, Aren was lying still, the shadows around him gone. But the darkness wasn't defeated. Not yet. And as Elara stood there, her heart pounding, the scroll in her hand pulsing with power, she realized the battle was far from over. The abyss was waiting, and it would not let her go so easily. Elara stood, her legs trembling beneath her as the weight of the Chronicle's power settled around her like a shroud. The chamber was unervingly quiet now, but the oppressive presence of the abyss lingered just out of reach, waiting, watching. Aren lay still on the cold stone floor, his breath shallow but steady. She had pulled him back from the brink, but only just. The shadows had receded, but their malevolent energy hung in the air like a storm about to break. The scroll in her hand pulsed again, its glow dimming as if it, too, was exhausted from the exertion. Yet, it remained a constant reminder of the choices she had made, and the ones she would soon face. She looked at it, the symbols shifting lazily, a strange calm settling over them. It was as if the Chronicle was catching its breath, waiting for her next move. Aren groaned softly, his eyes fluttering open. He looked pale, his face etched with pain and confusion, but there was a clarity in his eyes now that had been absent before. The darkness that had consumed him had retreated, though not entirely. She could still see the faint traces of shadow under his skin, like scars left by the abyss. Elara. His voice was weak, but it was him, truly him. What happened? She knelt beside him, relief flooding through her at the sound of his voice. I saved you, she said, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. But something still lingers. I don't know how to stop it. Aren's gaze drifted toward the scroll in her hand, his brow furrowing. The Chronicle, it's not just a tool, is it? It's alive in a way. Elara nodded. It's more than that. It's connected to the abyss, to the forces that have been locked away here for centuries. And it's bound us to it. Aren tried to sit up, wincing as he moved. Bound us? What do you mean? She hesitated, her eyes drifting to the shadows that still lingered at the edges of the chamber. When I used the chronicle to save you, it formed a connection between you, me, and the abyss. It's like a tether, and I don't know how to break it. Aren's expression darkened. So we're still trapped? Elara shook her head, frustration building in her chest. Not trapped. Not yet. But we're not free either. The abyss, whatever it is, it's not done with us. It's waiting for something. As if in response to her words, the ground beneath them rumbled softly, the shadows flickering at the edges of the chamber. The air grew colder, and the sense of something watching them intensified. Elara's grip on the scroll tightened instinctively, her heart pounding. A low, familiar voice echoed through the chamber, mocking and insidious. You think you've escaped? Foolish child. The craft is not so easily tamed. You've merely delayed the inevitable. Elara spun around, searching the darkness for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Only the shadows swirling at the edge of her vision. The voice felt closer this time, as if it was speaking directly into her mind. Aren's eyes widened, and he sat up straighter, his strength returning in small increments. That voice, it's the same one I heard before. When the darkness first took hold of me, Elara nodded, her jaw clenched. It's the entity that controls this place, the one trapped in the abyss. And it's not happy that we've meddled with its power. The voice laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down her spine. Meddled? No, child. You've done more than that. You've woken something ancient, something that cannot be undone. You have tasted the Chronicle's craft, but you do not yet understand its price. Elara swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling over her like a dark cloud. She had felt it, too, the cost of wielding the Chronicle's power. Every time she used it, the bond between her and the abyss grew stronger, tighter. It was as if the Chronicle was leading her deeper into a labyrinth of dark magic, each step taking her further from any hope of escape. What do you want from us? Elara demanded, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. We've done nothing to you. The shadows shifted again, and the voice hissed softly. Nothing? You broke the seal. You awakened the Chronicle. You allowed its power to flow freely. And now, you are bound to it. There is no escape. Aren, his strength returning, managed to get to his feet, though he still leaned heavily on Elara for support. There has to be a way out. There's always a way out. The voice's laughter filled the chamber again, cold and cruel. Foolish boy. There is no way out. The only path forward is deeper into the craft. You have already begun the journey. Now, you must finish it. Elara's heart sank. She knew the voice was right, in a way. The Chronicle had already entwined itself with her and Aren. Every choice she made seemed to draw them further into its web, and now the only way forward was to understand its full power. But at what cost? What does it want, Elara? Aren asked quietly, his eyes searching hers. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. It wants control. Of us. Of the Chronicle. And if we don't find a way to break this bond— The voice interrupted, its tone smug and sinister. You will become part of the abyss, as all who have wielded the Chronicle before you. Elara's hands clenched into fists. I won't let that happen. The ground trembled again, this time more violently, as if the abyss was growing impatient. The shadows began to swirl faster, creeping closer toward the center of the chamber. The scroll in her hand flared to life once more, the symbols rearranging themselves into a new, urgent pattern. One word glowed brightly at the center: descent. Elara's pulse quickened. The Chronicle was guiding her again, offering her a way forward, but she knew this wasn't a simple solution. Whatever lay ahead, it would be dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. Aren saw the shift in her expression and frowned. What is it? She showed him the scroll. It's telling me to descend. Into the abyss. Aren's face paled. You can't be serious. That's what it wants. To drag us deeper. Elara nodded, her stomach twisting with dread. I know, but we don't have a choice. If we don't face it, we'll be trapped here forever. And the longer we stay, the stronger the bond becomes. Aren's hand tightened around hers. Then we go together. Elara met his gaze, her fear mirrored in his eyes. But there was also determination, a resolve that matched her own. They had come this far together, and they would see it through to the end, whatever that might be. With a deep breath, Elara raised the scroll and whispered the word aloud. Descent. The chamber rumbled once more, and the floor beneath them began to shift, cracking open to reveal a swirling void of shadows. The abyss yawned wide, beckoning them with its dark, endless depths. The Chronicle's light flared, illuminating the path ahead, but the journey was far from clear. As the ground gave way beneath their feet, Elara and Aren plunged into the darkness, the void swallowing them whole. And the abyss waited, patient and hungry. Elara and Aren fell into the abyss, the world above vanishing in an instant as they were swallowed by the inky darkness. There was no sensation of wind, no rush of air, just a suffocating stillness, as if they were descending through thick, impenetrable shadow. The light from the Chronicle in Elara's hand flickered weakly, barely illuminating their surroundings. It was as though they were suspended in a void, with no sense of direction or time. Elara's heart raced, fear gnawing at her, but she forced herself to focus. She held Aren's hand tightly, the only tangible connection she had to reality. His grip was firm, though she could sense his uncertainty. She wasn't sure how long they had been falling. Seconds? Minutes? Hours? The passage of time seemed meaningless here. Suddenly, a jolt of energy shot through her, and the scroll in her hand flared with a blinding light. It wasn't warm or comforting, though. It felt cold and sharp, like the light of a distant star. Symbols danced across the surface, faster and more frenzied than before. Something was happening, something powerful. Without warning, their descent slowed, and the suffocating darkness around them began to change. The shadows twisted and shifted, forming shapes, vague, indistinct at first, but slowly growing more solid. The oppressive void around them transformed into a vast, labyrinthine expanse. Towering black stone walls rose up on either side of them, stretching endlessly into the distance. The ground beneath their feet became solid, though it was cold and lifeless, like the surface of a forgotten world. They had arrived somewhere. Elara glanced at Aren, who was pale but standing. His eyes were wide, scanning their surroundings. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elara didn't have an answer. The Chronicle pulsed in her hand, its light dim but steady. The symbols on it had stopped swirling, settling into a pattern that felt expectant, as if the Chronicle was waiting for something. They began to walk, cautiously, through the narrow stone passageway, the walls looming ominously overhead. The air was cold, and it carried with it a faint whisper, voices too soft to make out, but growing louder with each step. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, the stone cracked and ancient, as though this place had been abandoned for centuries. After what felt like hours of walking in the endless maze, they reached an open chamber. Unlike the claustrophobic corridors they had passed through, this space was vast, with high vaulted ceilings that disappeared into the gloom above. In the center of the chamber stood a massive stone monolith, covered in intricate carvings, symbols that glowed faintly with the same strange energy as the Chronicle. Elara and Aren approached cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The monolith hummed with power, and the air around it seemed to thrum with energy. Elara could feel the pull of the Chronicle, as if it was drawing her toward the stone. The closer she got, the more intense the connection became, until she could feel the very fabric of the abyss vibrating around her. Aren stopped a few feet away from the monolith, his hand tightening around hers. "Elara, I don't like this. It feels wrong." Elara nodded, her heart pounding. "I know, but I think this is why we're here. The Chronicle, it led us to this." The symbols on the monolith began to shift and change, glowing brighter with each passing moment. Elara could feel the energy building, rising tension that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. It was as though the entire abyss was converging on this single point, drawn by the power of the monolith and by the chronicle. And then, the voice returned. It echoed through the chamber, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. You've come this far, child. You've begun to understand the depths of the chronicle's craft. But you are not yet ready. Elara spun around, her eyes darting through the shadows. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once. She could feel its presence, vast and ancient, pressing in on her from all sides. But there was no figure, no face, only the voice, cold and relentless. I've seen enough, Elara said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. What do you want from us? The voice laughed, a hollow, mocking sound that reverberated through the chamber. What I want is irrelevant. The chronicle has already chosen its path, and you are bound to it. You seek to sever the bond, to free yourself and your brother from its grasp. But such power comes at a cost. Elara's stomach twisted. She had known from the beginning that there would be a price, but the weight of those words hit her like a blow. What cost? She demanded. The voice grew softer, almost a whisper. To sever one bond, another must be forged. The abyss is not so easily cheated, child. You will give something of equal value. A sacrifice. A chill ran down her spine. Sacrifice? The voice chuckled again. Yes. You cannot wield the chronicle's power without understanding the depths of its craft. The bond you share with the abyss is strong, but there is still time to choose how it will end. One of you must remain. Elara's breath caught in her throat. Remain? What do you mean? The shadows around them thickened, swirling ominously as the voice continued. You and your brother share a bond. The chronicle's power flows through both of you now, but only one of you can be freed from its grasp. The other must stay, bound to the abyss for eternity. Elara's heart raced, panic rising in her chest. No, there has to be another way. There is no other way, the voice hissed. You will choose, Elara. The chronicle demands balance. The abyss must be fed. One of you will be free. The other will take your place here, in the shadows. Elara's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The chronicle pulsed in her hand, its light dimming as if it, too, was waiting for her decision. Aren looked at her, his face pale but calm. Elara, no, you can't. I'm not choosing Aren, she said, her voice shaking. We'll find another way. But even as she said the words, she knew they were hollow. The abyss wasn't lying. The chronicle's power had always come with a price, and now it was demanding payment. One of them had to stay. One of them had to be consumed by the darkness. Aren stepped forward, his eyes locked on hers. It should be me. You saved me once, and now it's my turn. Elara shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. No. I can't lose you. The voice laughed again, cold and cruel. Time is running out, child. The abyss hungers. Make your choice. The chamber began to tremble, the shadows closing in around them, suffocating in their intensity. The chronicle in Elara's hand pulsed weakly, its light flickering as if it was dying. Elara's chest tightened, her mind racing. There had to be another way. Some way to outsmart the abyss, to break free without making this impossible choice. But the weight of the voice's words pressed down on her like a physical force. One of them had to stay. Elara, Aren whispered, his voice barely audible. And then, just as the darkness seemed ready to swallow them whole, the chronicle's light flared, brighter than ever before. The symbols on the scroll blazed with an intensity that made Elara's eyes water, and a single word appeared, glowing with impossible clarity. Merge. Elara's breath caught in her throat as the meaning of the word sank in. The word merge pulsed at her, shimmering with energy and possibility. Elara felt a rush of hope mixed with dread. She had seen the connection between her and Aren, how they were entwined by the power of the chronicle and the abyss. But merging? What would that mean for them? Merge, she whispered, glancing at Aren, who looked equally bewildered. What does it mean? I don't know, he replied, his voice trembling slightly, but it feels different, like it's offering us a chance to escape this choice. The voice echoed around them, amusement lacing its tone. Clever child, thinking you can escape the inevitable. Merging your essences would bind you closer. Yes, but it would also mean losing your individuality. You would become something new, a vessel for both your powers. You could navigate the darkness together, but you would no longer be just Elara and Aren. You would be one. Elara felt a pang in her chest at the thought. To lose herself, to lose Aren. Was this truly the solution? She looked at her brother, who was frowning in thought, weighing the consequences of this choice. Would it keep us safe from the abyss? Aren asked, his brow furrowing. Would it mean we could use the Chronicle's power without being consumed by it? Elara nodded slowly. We wouldn't be bound to one another or to the abyss in the same way. We would become part of something greater. Together, the voice chuckled, a sound that echoed like rolling thunder. So you understand the cost, then? You would relinquish your identities, your past, your desires. You would step into the unknown as a single entity. But tell me, do you believe you can conquer the abyss together, as one? Elara and Aren exchanged glances, their unspoken thoughts colliding. They had fought against the darkness for so long, had witnessed its horrors firsthand. But had they truly conquered it? Or would merging with the Chronicle simply make them pawns in a greater game? Another facet of the darkness they sought to escape. As the shadows thickened around them, the monolith pulsed, urging her forward. We don't have much time, she said, her voice steady despite her heart racing. I don't want to lose you, Aren, but I think we have to try. Aren took a deep breath, his resolve apparent. Then we do this together. Whatever it means, I trust you. I always have. Elara felt a surge of emotion wash over her. Their bond had always been strong, but this was a different kind of connection, one that transcended mere brotherhood. Then we merge, she said, the determination in her voice unwavering. The shadows roared around them, the chamber vibrating with energy. The air crackled, charged with the tension of their choice. They stepped closer to the monolith, its symbols glowing brighter, resonating with their presence. As they reached out, their fingers brushed against the cool surface of the stone, and a shockwave of energy surged through them. Together, Elara shouted, her heart racing as she grasped Aren's hand tightly. The moment their hands connected, a blinding light erupted from the monolith, engulfing them in a cocoon of brilliance. The very fabric of reality shifted, and for a heartbeat, they were suspended in a kaleidoscope of colors and sensations. Memories flooding back, both theirs and not theirs, weaving into a tapestry of emotions and experiences. Visions surged through her mind. Their childhood laughter, the warmth of the sun on their faces, the smell of fresh rain, the warmth of family dinners, and then the shadows creeping in, the fear, the darkness, the way it had threatened to tear them apart. Elara felt herself slipping, her individuality blurring. But amidst the chaos, a clarity emerged. They were not just their past experiences, nor were they merely shadows or light. They were two souls intertwined, and this merging was not about loss but transformation. As the blinding light dimmed, they found themselves in a new realm, a place where light and shadow coexisted, swirling together in harmony. They stood in a vast expanse, surrounded by shimmering trails of energy that danced around them like fireflies. The air hummed with a strange, melodic resonance that seemed to echo their very essence. What is this place? Aren asked, all lighting up his features. I think we did it, Elara breathed, marveling at the vivid colors that enveloped them. We merged. We're together in this new existence. They looked at each other, and Elara felt an overwhelming rush of connection, a bond deeper than they had ever shared. They were still themselves but infused with something greater, something powerful. Their thoughts, feelings, and instincts resonated in a way that was entirely new yet familiar. As they explored their surroundings, the energy pulsating around them felt alive. They could sense the ebb and flow of power, how it responded to their thoughts and emotions. The abyss, once a source of fear, was now a canvas of potential, waiting for them to shape it with their newfound abilities. But the voice returned, louder now, its tone a mix of anger and curiosity. You think you have escaped? You think you can wield the Chronicle as one and remain free from my grasp? Elara and Aren turned to face the swirling shadows that began to converge around them. The voice was closer now, its presence almost tangible, thickening the air with tension. "We're not afraid of you," Elara shouted, the resolve surging within her. "We've embraced the Chronicle's power. We're stronger together." The voice hissed, the shadows shifting violently. "Strength? You are but fledgling sparks in a tempest. The abyss will not allow your union to persist. It hungers for dominance, and I will reclaim what is mine." The ground trembled beneath them, the colors of the realm swirling chaotically as the shadows began to take form. Creatures of darkness emerged, their shapes fluid and nightmarish, each one a twisted reflection of the fears they had faced before. Aren stood beside her, his energy intertwining with hers, solidifying their resolve. "We will not back down," he declared, his voice ringing with determination. "We will not be your pawns." As they spoke, they felt the bond of the merge strengthening, their powers amplifying. The energy swirled around them, forming a protective barrier, and they instinctively reached out, drawing upon the light and shadow within the realm. "Let's show them what we can do," Elara said, her eyes sparkling with determination. Together, they focused their will, channeling their shared essence into a single beam of light that shot forth from their combined energy, striking at the heart of the approaching darkness. The light collided with the shadows, causing a violent explosion that sent ripples through the realm. The creatures of the abyss writhed and shrieked as the beam of energy tore through them, scattering them like dust in the wind. But as the light surged, the voice roared in fury. "You may have won this battle, but the abyss is eternal. You cannot escape your fate." The shadows reformed, growing denser and more menacing, swirling around them with an intensity that made the very air tremble. Elara could feel the darkness pressing against their protective barrier, trying to breach their newfound strength. "Hold strong," she urged, feeling the power of their merge coursing through them. "We can fight this." Together, they harnessed the light and shadow within them, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. With every ounce of their will, they fought against the voice, their bond serving as a conduit for the Chronicle's energy. The world around them became a tumultuous battleground, light and shadow clashing in a dance of power and desperation. The abyss roared in rage, trying to swallow them whole, but they held fast, refusing to yield. Then, in a moment of clarity, Elara realized they had the power not just to fight, but to reshape the very fabric of the abyss. Drawing deep from their connection, she focused on the core of the darkness, envisioning a world where light and shadow coexisted in harmony. "Let's change it," she shouted, determination igniting within her. "Let's reshape this place." Aren nodded, his eyes blazing with purpose. Together, they envisioned a new reality, one where the shadows were not merely to be fought but embraced, where darkness did not equate to despair. As they projected their combined will, a new light exploded from them, a radiant pulse that expanded outward, engulfing the chamber and pushing back against the shadows. The swirling darkness began to dissolve, not in defeat but in a transformative shimmer, morphing into vibrant shades of color that danced harmoniously with the light. The voice of the abyss screamed in protest, but Elara and Aren remained steadfast, their connection deepening as they reshaped the world around them. They became the architects of this realm, weaving together the threads of light and shadow into a tapestry of balance and beauty. The chaotic energy settled, and as the shadows transformed into intricate patterns, the world around them began to take form. They stood at the center of it, pulsing with power, and Elara felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. But in the back of her mind, the voice lingered, a reminder of the uncertainty that still lay ahead. "You may have changed this realm, but the abyss is vast and ever hungry. Your journey is far from over." Elara and Aren exchanged glances, determination etched in their expressions. They had faced the abyss and emerged stronger, but they knew the true test was yet to come. As the remnants of the darkness shifted into shadows of potential, they prepared to navigate the complexities of this new existence, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them in the labyrinth of the abyss, together. As the newly transformed realm settled around them, Elara and Aren marveled at the kaleidoscope of light and shadow that danced harmoniously. They had reshaped the abyss into a place where the darkness no longer represented fear but potential, an uncharted landscape of creativity waiting to be explored. But even in this moment of triumph, Elara could feel the lingering presence of the abyss, a reminder of the challenges they had faced and those yet to come. They had changed their surroundings, but the vastness of the abyss still stretched beyond their newly formed haven, and whispers of uncertainty curled around them like tendrils of mist. "Where do we go from here?" Aren asked, his brow furrowed as he surveyed the colorful horizon before them. "I think we create," Elara replied, her voice filled with conviction. "We've harnessed the power of the chronicle and the abyss. We can shape this world, explore its depths, and protect it from the shadows that linger. But we must be vigilant. This place is still fragile, and there may be other forces at play." Aren nodded, a smile breaking through the uncertainty on his face. "Together, we'll be unstoppable. We can defend this realm and ensure that darkness does not return." As they moved forward, their hands intertwined. The very ground beneath them responded, blooming with vibrant colors and luminescent patterns. Creatures of light began to emerge from the shadows, beings that had once been prisoners of the abyss, now free to roam and thrive. They looked at Elara and Aren with gratitude, their eyes shimmering with the remnants of hope and joy. With every step, they felt the bond between them strengthen, their connection as siblings and now as co-creators solidifying into something greater. Together, they explored the intricate pathways of this new realm, discovering hidden wonders and unlocking secrets buried within the depths of the abyss. They sculpted landscapes of light and shadow, forging allies from those who had once been lost to the darkness. But as they ventured deeper, they also encountered remnants of the old abyss, echoes of its past horrors that lingered like ghosts, shadows that whispered doubts, fears that clawed at their resolve. Yet each time the darkness threatened to engulf them, they drew strength from one another, reminding themselves of the power they held together. One day, as they stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking a valley of shimmering light, Elara felt a familiar chill in the air. A shadow flickered in the distance, a reminder that the abyss was not fully vanquished. It had merely retreated for now, biding its time. "We have to remain vigilant," Elara said, a determined glint in her eyes. "The abyss will come again. We need to be ready." Aren nodded, his expression resolute. "Together, we can face anything. We've transformed the darkness into light. We just need to ensure it stays that way." With newfound purpose, they began to devise plans to fortify their realm. They gathered the creatures of light, sharing knowledge and strategies to protect their newfound home. They trained together, honing their skills and abilities, preparing for the inevitable return of the abyss. As days turned into weeks, they forged alliances with other beings who had once been consumed by the darkness. Together, they stood as guardians of the realm, a united force against the lurking shadows that threatened to reclaim their world. But even in their preparations, Elara couldn't shake the feeling of dread that loomed on the horizon. Every flicker of shadow seemed to pulse with an awareness, an intelligence that felt unsettling. The abyss was far from defeated, and it was watching. One fateful night, as they gathered under the light of 1,000 stars, a chilling wind swept through the valley. The shadows deepened, and the familiar voice echoed through the air, more ominous than ever. "Did you really think you could escape me? The abyss is eternal, and it will always hunger for what it has lost. Your union may have created light, but it has also weakened the boundaries between worlds. I will reclaim my dominion." Elara's heart raced, her resolve unwavering. She turned to Aren, their hands clasped tightly together. "We won't let it win. We're stronger than it knows." And with that, they prepared for the fight of their lives, knowing that the true battle for their realm had just begun.